How can the latest crop of parenting books help with everything parents need help with?
I think a lot of behavioral books you have to find the one that works for you.
Our Help Desk columnist, Judith Newman, is here to tell us about everything from ADHD to parenting in the age of Trump. What happened in 1922 that changed the face of literature?
When you write about authors like Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot, E.M. Forster, D.H. Lawrence, they are touching raw nerves.
Bill Goldstein will be here to discuss his new book, The World Broke in Two. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we're reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Our Help Desk columnist, Judith Newman, joins us now to talk about the latest in parenting books. Judith, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. I'm very excited about this podcast. I have a vested interest in the subject matter. I'm going to run very quickly through all the titles that we're going to talk about, and then we can sort of go back one by one. Each title, I have to say, of these books is like compelling in its own way. All right. The first is Ignore It: How Selectively Looking the Other Way Can Decrease Behavioral Problems and Increase Parenting Satisfaction by Catherine Perlman. I'm troubled a little bit by the phrase parenting satisfaction, but we'll move on.
They seem like mutually exclusive words.
Yes.
Too, right? Right.
The next one is The Grown-Up's Guide to Teenage Humans: How to Decode Their Behavior, Develop Unshakable Trust, and Raise a Respectable Adult by Josh Shipp. Maybe we should do that one last. We'll go up in age order. The next one is How Do I Explain This to My Kids? Parenting in the Age of Trump, which is an anthology edited by Sarah Swang and Diane Wachtel with an introduction and commentary by Dr. Ava Siegler. The next is Gentle Discipline: Using Emotional Connection, Not Punishment, to Raise Confident, Capable Kids by Sarah Ockwell Smith. And then finally, The Myth of the ADHD Child: 101 Ways to Improve Your Child's Behavior and Attention Span Without Drugs, Labels, or Coercion by Thomas Armstrong. Let's start with this last one because it says on the front, revised edition. So is this a kind of classic in this area of ADHD?
Yes, I think this book was originally written about 20 years ago. And of course, there's been a lot of research on ADHD since then. But the man's essential premise remains, which is that we are wildly overdiagnosing this condition in this country. And every year there's a greater and greater number of prescriptions for ADHD-related drugs. And he is suggesting not that the condition doesn't exist, but that it's not just mysteriously an American situation where there is a huge number of American kids and not in other countries. He is just suggesting that there are many different alternatives to treating ADHD, and also not just a question of not using drugs, but that we are expecting too much of our children too soon. We're not really following the ideas of developmental milestones that other countries do. I mean, when you consider that in Nordic countries, kids don't go to school at all until they're 7 years old. And we're shoving them into school when they're 3 years old and actually giving them homework, too, when they're 3 and 4 years old.
When they should be running around and throwing things.
Exactly. I mean, that's what they should be doing with their lives.
So given the Nordic exception where everything is, better than everywhere else, comparing the U.S. with other countries, is ADHD diagnosed in a greater percentage of the population here than in other places?
A much greater percentage. In this country, something like 11% of kids age 5 to 17 are diagnosed with ADHD. And the prescriptions for Ritalin and Adderall have increased steadily since the 1990s. So sales are projected to be something like $17.5 billion with these essentially amphetamines by 2020.
Wow.
Which is astounding when you think of it. So what is the doctor doing? He's saying, okay, medicine has a place, but it should be a last resort, not a first resort. And he gives literally 101 different alternatives to that. I mean, everything from meditation for kids to a certain level of mindfulness to pet therapy, something that my son particularly, who's been lobbying for a puppy for a long time, loved, to touch therapy. I mean, everything you can imagine. And I say in this piece, I've seen the great difference that drugs can make. I used to be completely anti-medication, but when you have a child who turns to you and says, after taking Adderall, oh, this is what it must be like to feel normal, your attitude about medication changes. But nevertheless, it's a very important addition, I think, to the literature.
Why did Thomas Armstrong go back and revise this 20 years later? Are there specific changes that have occurred or new research or issues that he wanted to address? Or did he reconsider some of what he wrote in the original edition?
I think he got a lot of criticism for discounting medication and discounting the existence of ADHD. Or at least that's how people read the book. And some might read this book that way. But he has somewhat, very slightly altered his ideas about this. But what he hasn't altered his ideas about is this notion that we go to drugs first. And that is a terrible mistake for kids and a terrible mistake for this country.
All right, let's talk about the next two books together, which I think we can kind of group under behavioral problems / punishment, but not punishment. Those two books are Gentle Discipline by Sarah Ockwell Smith and Ignore It, How Selectively Looking the Other Way Can Decrease Behavioral Problems and Increase Parenting Satisfaction by Catherine Perlman. Tell us about these two books.
Well, they do both deal with behavior, and Gentle Discipline is part of a Gentle series that the author has done from England. And she's very much a proponent of attachment parenting. I think she popularized that to some extent in England. So what she's saying here, she's talking in this book about the many, many reasons that kids will behave badly. And you can kind of sum up her whole parenting philosophy with the idea that, as she says, if you want kids to behave better, you have to make them feel better, which is very true in many ways. And she is very quick to say that this doesn't mean that you're permissive with kids, but they have to be led to understand their own behavioral issues in a lot of ways. And there's much good in what she says, but to practice her brand of parenting, I kind of think you got to be a full-time parent. You just need a lot of time because she's got a lot of opinions about this, about distracting kids, which is certainly was my go-to when my kid had a meltdown. My favorite thing to do was look at that shiny object over there, because if you just continued to concentrate on what the kid was doing, it would just devolve into in a really not great way. But she feels that distracting kids from their emotions will make them not believe their own emotions are okay. And as I say, in theory, that sounds good. But frankly, if my kid were having a meltdown about, wanting to buy a Hot Wheels in a Walmart, I would just not take that time to allow him to explore his emotional landscape. I would really just throw some candy at him and get out of there. So you have to have a level of patience that I don't have to really practice her kind of parenting skills, which is not to say they're bad or wrong. A lot
They're
of
good for some people.
They're good for some people. Yeah, I think a lot of behavioral books you have to find the one that works for you. The one that would work much better for me is one called Ignore It, because I love this author's kind of B.F. Skinner approach to children. Just pretend your child's a pigeon and know that when a behavior happens, the next behavior that happens after that is the one that will determine whether the previous behavior is repeated. And it's really very basic. It's just saying that for most kids, attention, whether it's good attention or bad attention, is a good thing. If you
Meaning a good thing for the child?
A good thing for the child.
What they want is attention, and they often don't differentiate between negative and positive attention.
Exactly. If your child knows that you're going to scream at him if he's poking his sister, that's better than you not paying any attention at all. So what she says is very simple. It's that you have to notice the tiny good things that your child does, and you have to completely ignore the obnoxious things.
Dr. Perlman has a process that she advocates, that she says will return the joy to child rearing. What are the steps in that process?
She does talk about a process, which is you have to not get engaged in a power struggle over nothing. And you have to not give your child the gift of your attention for misbehavior. You have to give the gift of attention for behavior, which is harder to do because a lot of times when your kid is behaving well, that's a moment of great relief in your mind, and you go back to playing words with friends. Not that I would know anything about that.
The next book is The Grown-Up's Guide to Teenage Humans: How to Decode Their Behavior, Develop Unshakable Trust, and Raise a Respectable Adult. Those all sound like very desirable things. Does Josh Shipp, the author, help you with them?
This was a very touching book to me in many ways because, in a sense, we should never have heard of Josh Shipp. He was in the foster care system himself, and he actually kept a diary of all of his foster care placements when he was a young teenager. And he wanted to see just how quickly he could get kicked out of a house. And he was terrible. And he got kicked out in almost record time by many places until he met a man named Rodney. Now, Rodney was a middle school teacher, and Josh basically, as a 14-year-old, did everything he could to get kicked out of this guy's house. It was like his greatest hits. He shoplifted, he got drunk at school, he passed bad checks, and then at one point where he managed to get himself in jail, and Rodney let him just stay in jail overnight, but he managed to do this. He got him back home. Rodney got him back home, and he said, "You got to get it through your thick head, son. We don't see you as a problem. We see you as an opportunity." And that very phrase really turned his life around. And what he does now, he runs a teen empowerment group himself. And what he tries to do in this book is explain the mind of teenagers and kind of explain where they are in terms of what they need that we don't realize. Because whereas Perlman talked about the need to ignore behavior, that's at a certain period of life. She's mostly talking about younger children. Shipp's idea is that you do need to pay attention much of the time is really for teenagers. And it's a certain...
That's so interesting because that's really the opposite of what most people do. They pay lots and lots of attention to young children, and then when the kids are teenagers, they think they're sort of supposed to back off.
And he says that's absolutely the wrong approach. He said that what kids don't talk out, they will act out. So you need to be a presence. Even when your kid doesn't seem to want to talk to you, you have to be available to talk to them pretty much as you can. And you have to understand, according to him, and I take his word for this because I think he's been there, that no matter what your kid says about not wanting you around, they want you around, and they want it when they've done something bad, they want to be caught. He gives example after example of situations with kids doing awful things and one adult being able to come in and turn that situation around. So I found it, in addition to being a smart book, a very touching one.
Okay, this next one does not sound especially touching. The last one that we'll talk about is How Do I Explain This to My Kids? Parenting in the Age of Trump. And there's a little banner on the front that says Fearless Books for Perilous Times.
Yeah, this book, there is a lot of hand-wringing in this book. And as I say in the column, the very fact that somebody found that they needed to write a book, it's part essays and part advice, but that people felt they need to write a book about our president as if he's an illegal drug or an STD, says something about the times that we're in. I should preface this by saying that you're not going to find a range of opinions here. This is a book by progressives, for progressives. There's no essay floating around in there that can give the plus side of a Trump presidency.
Right, or even the Trump presidency isn't so bad.
Right. It's pretty grim. But at the same time, while there's kind of a one-note quality to this, there are also, in my mind, some very, very interesting essays.
What's interesting is I've seen this and heard about it from others that in school situations, camp situations, the adults are saying no politics because it's become so divisive.
Look at what just happened. Look at the fact that our president is asking a bunch of Boy Scouts at a Boy Scout jamboree to boo Obama, and then starts talking to him about, or sort of hinting about orgies on a boat that he used to be on. It's kind of unhinged and kind of funny. But imagine you have to be the head of the Boy Scouts apologizing to parents about this.
Yeah.
So while I kind of thought that this book was a bit more earnest than I would like, I also do understand the reason for its existence. On the other hand, I think it might just be good for parents to turn on MSNBC and CNN and just let them watch for a little while.
They could also read the New York Times.
Oh, yeah. The New York Times.
Judith, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was our Help Desk columnist, Judith Newman, talking about 5 new books on parenting. Bill Goldstein joins us now. He is the book critic at NBC's Weekend Today in New York and author of a new book, The World Broken Two: Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature. Bill, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Many initials in those names.
I know, it was so funny that I chose a woman with a full name and only men who used their initials. So.
Yes, it's usually the opposite, or at least it is these days.
Exactly. S.E. Hinton.
Let's stop with the title, though, which is a very evocative phrase, The World Broke in Two, but it's not yours.
No. It's Willa Cather wrote in 1936 in a collection of essays called Not Under 40, which was about changes in literary fashion. She wrote that the world broke in two in 1922 or thereabouts. And she imagined in 1936 that anyone under 40 wouldn't really understand the writers whom she revered. And so it was a book of essays looking to some of the older writers, including Thomas Mann, who she felt was a modernist, but she also admired.
Is that how you came to start thinking about the year 1922?
Well, it was accidental. When I was younger, I audited a class at CUNY, City University of New York Graduate Center, a year-long seminar on Proust, reading it in English. And I thought, well, this is the only way I'm really going to get through Proust, is to take a class.
To assign it to yourself as the professor.
Exactly. And it was actually a great novelty to be back in school. And then the other thing was the class met once a week for 2 hours in the evening, and I was able to keep up with the assignments, which were about 150 pages a week. And so while I was reading Proust, something occurred to me about Virginia Woolf, wondering whether Virginia Woolf had read Proust and what she thought of him. And she didn't write an essay about Proust, but she had written a lot in her diaries and letters. And I saw that in January 1922, just before she turned 40, she was ill, very sick with influenza, and she was also very depressed about the state of her work. She was about to finish a really great novel, Jacob's Room, which was her first kind of modernist novel, experimental novel. But she was in despair that she wouldn't finish it. And she wrote a letter to E.M. Forster complaining about her age and saying, well, I'm about to turn 40, but you should really only count me 35 because I've spent so much time sick in bed. And also, she wrote, writing is like heaving bricks over a wall. And in that letter, she talked about Proust. She hadn't read him, she said, and she was hesitating. She was listening to other people's reports, and she was shivering on the brink of it because she was afraid that if she did read it, she would be submerged and go down and down and down and down and never come up again. And then I saw that actually in the spring of 1922, she did start reading Proust, and it had an immediate effect on her. She read it in French. So I noticed that in the story that she began to write just after reading Proust, which was Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, which gives rise to her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, she has Clarissa Dalloway walking through the streets thinking of her childhood, and she says something like, "A cup with a blue ring, a leaf of mint could bring it back." And I think everyone knows something about Proust, or anyone who knows something about Proust would know the Madeleine, and the way the Madeleine dipped in tea brings back the past. And so I thought, oh, this is such an explicit echo. And then as I started to think about it a little more, it turned out that E.M. Forster also read Proust in March of 1922, and it had an immediate effect on him too. And he had read it in French. He bought it in Marseille on the way home from a trip to India. And he had abandoned the novel that became A Passage to India before the war. He had started it in 1911, and he stopped writing it after about 75 pages. And he hadn't worked on it in almost a decade. And when he came back from India, he had gone there to try to revive the novel, but he was unsuccessful. And on the trip home, he stops in Marseille. He begins to read Proust on the last leg of his trip just before he gets home. And he talks about what an impact it has on him. And he's in love, he says, with the embroidered ribbon of Proust. And so the fact that Proust had such an effect on these two authors in such a short period of time, I mean, in the spring of 1922, I started to think about what work they did after reading Proust and what effect it had on their lives. And then I noticed that D.H. Lawrence also had a transformative year. T.S. Eliot, who was a close friend and a kind of enemy, a frenemy or something of Virginia Woolf. They were friends and jealous of one another in a lot of ways. He too had an amazing year because The Wasteland was published at the end of the year, but he had begun the year in a sanitarium in Switzerland, having had a nervous breakdown. And he, at the end of 1921, was still working on the poem, and he wrote to a friend, he was working on it, and he said, "I don't know whether it will work." And so the fact that a year later it had seemed to me to be a great story if I could tell it.
Did you know it was going to be these four characters, or were there others that you considered who flitted in and out?
Well, yes, it was, I guess, attrition, omission. I knew that the story of Marcel Proust was also interesting, and also James Joyce, because Ulysses was published at the beginning of 1922 in February. And I realized that for me, the story of their lives, because Proust dies at the end of 1922. He dies in November of 1922. But I couldn't tell his story because it would involve too much that was extraneous to the changes that I wanted to show had happened in 1922. And also James Joyce would be also in that same way too involving. So what I decided to focus on is the effect that Ulysses and Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time had on this array of writers. Eliot knew Joyce, and for my purposes, a wonderful beginning to the year for Eliot was that after his nervous breakdown in Lausanne, or he's in Lausanne, Switzerland for treatment, he goes to Paris, and in the first week of January, he sees Ezra Pound, who's his mentor and editor, and Ezra Pound arranges a dinner for himself, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Horace Liveright, who was to become Eliot's publisher, New York publisher, who was on his first trip to Europe scouting for books. And so that was a way to get James Joyce in, and also, as I say, the impact that Ulysses had on these other writers. Because Virginia Woolf read Ulysses, she hated it on many grounds.
I love the way that she praised her disdain.
Yes, exactly. I mean, she talks about him as a queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples, and it's venomous and actually not very nice to read that. I mean, she's writing in her diary, but she also has great disdain for the artistic effort of Ulysses. I mean, she really does sort of elide the difference between, or the distinction between the man and the book in a way that makes you uncomfortable while you're reading it. But she did have a great artistic justification for her disappointment in it. She thought it was a great work, but not a work of genius of the first order. And she
Well.
Exactly. I mean, it's such a relief to see a writer like that having objections to it, because it's a very difficult book. And she read it feeling, she said, like a martyr bound to a stake. And she did.
I think
finish
many
it.
readers would second that sentiment.
Yes, exactly. I mean, she was, I think, someone we could all identify with. One, because she was so anxious about turning 40. And then also, she found Joyce so difficult to read, and she didn't really understand very much about what was going on in it. And I think more than that, she didn't really care. She felt in a deep way that we didn't really learn enough about the characters. And yet the example of Ulysses led her in another direction that made her look at how the novel she wanted to write, which became Mrs. Dalloway, could do similar things but very differently. And I think she also felt very strongly that what the men were doing was very different from what she as a woman wanted to do. So reading this novel sharpened her sense of what she as a woman writer wanted to do and how she wanted to create characters. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that in reading that book, she focused on a woman, Clarissa Dalloway, and then in the end called her novel Mrs. Dalloway, a novel about a woman seen from the inside.
So let's go back to 1922. Proust had published In Search of Lost Time. Ulysses had come out. What else was going on? Obviously, it's still the aftermath of World War I.
Right.
But what else is going on in the world of literature? Is this what the masses are reading?
No, I think, well, what's very interesting to me about 1922 is, one, I wanted to focus on the personal lives of these writers and how it affects what they write. But the culture is remarkably similar. I mean, when you write about authors like Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot, E.M. Forster, D.H. Lawrence, they are touching raw nerves, but they are not necessarily touching them in the way that reverberates with the larger population at the time. But the aftermath of the war is one of those things that I think, as we see in our own time after a historic event, say 9/11 or something like that, that in many ways the story is how much life has changed, but then also how life goes on in many ways as before, and that the loss many individuals have felt because so many people have died is sort of forgotten in some way in the, I hate this phrase, but the march of history. There's a lot going on that is just sort of entertaining. The marriage of Princess Mary is a big event at the beginning of 1922, and you see even celebrity culture there, and Virginia Woolf is writing in her diary about the wedding. And so there's a lot going on that means that the war had its impact, but people are trying to move on. One of the major changes, and it was such a surprise to me that it took so long for this to happen, is that in the fall of 1921 and the winter of 1922, for the first time since 1915, the pub hours and the licensing hours in London, so restaurants and pubs can now go back to what is called their pre-war liberties. So it's been for almost 3 or almost 4 years since the war, and it's only now that the service hours are being relaxed. And so you read in the newspapers about this parliamentary debate because it's just like prohibition in America. There are a lot of people who prefer having these more stringent limited hours for the sake of morality. And then you have hotel people and bar owners basically begging to go back to the pre-war liberties, as I say.
A lot of readers today, and perhaps at the time as well, when they hear the term modernist literature, they're sort of, they can feel themselves mentally putting a book aside.
Yeah.
What do we mean when we describe a novel as modernist?
Well, I think what I decided it meant and what I try to convey in the book is that it was a way of looking at characters from the inside. We've all heard the phrase and maybe run away from it, stream of consciousness. And that's somewhat what was going on. But really the idea that Virginia Woolf had and that she developed really after reading Joyce and Proust was that if you could tell the story from inside, you would really tell the story of what someone looked like in the world in a better way, and that the curlicues of thought, the way the mind works, could be reproduced on the page, but it should be done with enough clarity that you could really understand this person. And I think each of these writers did it in a different way, somewhat building on the way their own mind works. I mean, so The Wasteland reflects Eliot's mind and his life at that time. Forster was a little afraid of that kind of modernist technique. And so what he did is he saw that a lot of what he called the blue books of characters, just all the details that laden down a novel about, what a room looks like, what a person looks like, that if you cut a lot of that out, you could then focus on what people were doing and thinking. And so that was the lesson he learned from 1922, that he in 1922, is he adapted these techniques to his own purpose, which is also what Lawrence did. Lawrence also wrote a novel that year called Kangaroo, which was a very autobiographical novel, but he, as he wrote, basically almost put himself on a psychoanalyst's couch, but he didn't do it, he felt, in the same navel-gazing way that he complained that Proust and Joyce did it. And really, one of the wonderful things about Eliot, even as he finishes The Wasteland, is one of the tenets of his critical philosophy was that the poet didn't really know more about what was going on in a poem than a reader did, that his interpretation, the poet's interpretation, was no more valid in a certain sense than the reader's. And he, in The Wasteland, gave what his friends, including Virginia Woolf and his own mother, recognized as an autobiographical portrait of him at that time. And so I tried to show how Eliot transforms some of what was going on in his marriage into the poem. And that way you can find your way into these books, I think, I hope, and into the poem.
All right. Well, hopefully that'll bring more readers into these works.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you for being here.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bill Goldstein is the author of The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature. Alexandra Alter joins us now with notes from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
So you've got good news this week.
This week, the news is good. I'm not reporting on any lawsuits or anything like that. In fact, I'm looking at some numbers for publishers for their quarterly earnings reports and also for the industry overall, and the numbers are looking positive for once. 2016 was flat compared to 2015, according to the Association of American Publishers. And of course, it was a hard year for publishers because of the election. But in the first quarter of 2017, revenues for book publishers were up $108 million. So that's an almost 5% increase over the first quarter of 2016.
How can that be?
Well, it's interesting, and that's according to the Association of American Publishers. So they track a wide sort of swath of the industry. It was a little surprising because there haven't been huge breakout hits this year. I think you've seen a lot of backlist titles doing well because of TV shows like The Handmaid's Tale and things like that.
Game of Thrones.
Of course, Game of Thrones. Anything that gets adapted for the big or small screen
so
always
it's all about
TV
is what you're saying?
Not necessarily. I'm trying to figure it out. I mean, I think it's interesting that print sales have stabilized and are even growing. One of the categories that the AAP saw an increase in was in hardcover books, which grew 8.2% in that period, which is kind of surprising. Digital audio is, of course, still growing massively. That was up almost 30%. And ebooks declined again by around 5%. So a smaller drop than we've been seeing in other quarters. So I was curious to see sort of how the major houses are benefiting from these trends, and they're doing pretty well. According to a recent earnings report from Simon & Schuster, their revenues were up 10% in the second quarter, which ended on June 30th. Its operating income was also up 8%. And they were pointing to, some big fall titles that they have coming out. So they're expecting this whole year to look pretty good. They have the Hillary Clinton memoir. They have Stephen King and Owen King's book. They also have a new Walter Isaacson book and a book by Tom Brady. So it looks like the fall is going to be big for them.
So what you're saying is the TV and the internet are over. And it's all about books now.
And, this trend has sort of carried over into other houses too. Hachette had a good earnings report recently. Its sales were up 5% in the first half of 2017. And Houghton Mifflin Harcourt also showed a sales increase of almost 10% in the second quarter.
Wow.
And they are the publisher of The Handmaid's Tale, and so they had a big backlist and ebook sales boost from the TV show. So it'll be interesting to see if this continues and also, if there are big breakout hits later in the year, how that will skew. Right now it seems like everyone's benefiting equally and doing well. And then sometimes one publishing house will pull ahead if they have a huge hit. So.
And you had some other good news in the book-selling world.
Yes. This is from our neighbors up in Canada, the Indigo Books, which is a chain there. And I believe there's been rumors that they're going to be expanding into North America, into the United States, which would be interesting to see how, Barnes & Noble will hold up against them. But they have been a very successful chain, and they recently reported that their revenue rose almost 7% in the first quarter, which ended on July 1st for them.
And how many stores do they have in Canada?
According to their recent figures, they have 89 superstores and 122 small format stores across the country. They saw a rise in their sales in their physical stores as well as online sales.
Good news.
Yes, and in good bookstore news in the United States, recently it was reported that Politics and Prose is going to open another location. This is a beloved bookstore in Washington, D.C. They already have 2 locations, and they're opening a third in this new area in D.C.'s southwest waterfront.
So some people in Washington are still reading.
That's apparently the case, yes. They're certainly all publishing memoirs, as we know.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, my colleagues, Greg Coles, John Williams, and Parl Sagal. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, before we start, let's just say that this is Parl's probably last regular appearance on this segment of the podcast because she is the newest book critic for the New York Times and is therefore abandoning this ragtag group and will be reviewing books in the Daily New York Times
I'm so excited.
forward.
I'm excited, but I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss this, and I'm going to find ways to.
We'll bring you back.
Yeah, we'll get you back.
Reunion shows. It's always good for ratings.
So congratulations to Parl Sagal.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, applause.
Thank you.
All right, let's now get to the books. You have a very big one in front of you, Greg.
It's big, but it's a quick read and it's a lot of fun. I've gone back to a book that came out last year that has just sat on my shelf since then, Bruce Springsteen's memoir, Born to Run. It's part of this whole trend of rock and roll memoirs that really kicked off with Keith Richards' Life, a book I also read and liked a lot, and then Patti Smith's 2 memoirs, Just Kids and M. I think she's working on a 3rd even. And those are both books that I also read and enjoyed. And so now I'm reading this one. It's very long. It's probably 500 pages. I'm about 120 pages in, and as you might suspect, with it being that long, he doesn't move quickly through his life. I'm 120 pages in, and he's still a teenager and has not yet hit the big time. But he's so much fun. He's like a real good time Charlie. There's something very old fashioned about him. He's at 17, 18. Not a drinker, he doesn't do drugs, but it is the late 60s, and he's participating in that whole general vibe, and he's very much a rock and roller. The part that I've just read, he's been approached possibly to play guitar in Janis Joplin's band, and he's entertaining that idea. It's just a lot of fun. It's this New Jersey kid. Like, I'm a 47-year-old white guy from the New York suburbs. I grew up as a Bruce Springsteen fan, and so I'm enjoying this book a lot.
You're the market. Does he have a dark side, Bruce?
He does, but it's not there yet in this. What's interesting is he talks a lot about kind of walking the line between this 60s freedom. He's very into free love. He's shacking up a lot with different girls. He's embracing that part of the 60s. But at the same time, he grew up in really a blue-collar environment. He has a construction worker brother-in-law who he says kind of never came into the 60s. He just spent his whole life living in the 50s. And Springsteen himself feels part of both cultures.
I think there's some darkish stuff with his dad at some point, but nothing.
Yeah, his dad. I mean, one of the reasons that Springsteen doesn't drink is that his dad is severely alcoholic and rage-filled. So yes, there is dark stuff there, and Springsteen says, nothing could get Bruce angry in a bar except for an out-of-control drunk person getting in his face. And that was very much the father issues.
So the one time that I met Bruce Springsteen was in a bar, I have to say.
You were drunk out of your mind.
Yes. I'm also from the New York suburbs, but not a 40-something male, and therefore maybe not quite the demographic. But I have to say that the fans who were at this book party to celebrate the publication of this memoir greeted him often with tears streaming down their face and, hugs. And he was lovely.
It's the first
And
tape
you
I
weren't
ever
there,
owned.
Greg. Sorry.
Born in the USA.
Rub it in.
USA.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was away on vacation last week, and I read almost nothing,
What?
which was great.
That's stunning.
Yes.
You usually come back and embarrass us all. We feel shamed.
I know. Well, I felt bad about that. And so I thought, I'll make you guys look good this one time. No, I was upstate in a couple of different places and just kind of enjoying nature and driving around and going into weird old stores and going to the horse races in Saratoga. And so the one thing that I brought that I kind of dipped into is Mary Ruefle's book called My Private Property. Ruefle is a poet, which Greg, I'm sure, knows, and I'm not that familiar with her poetry, but she has a previous book of essays called Madness, Rack, and Honey.
Brilliant.
Which
My favorite.
is one of my favorite books of essays ever, probably, but definitely from the last few years. That was recommended to me by Ben Ratliff, who the former reporter and critic here at the Times, who's a brilliant reader. And he recommended that to me. This is not quite as – those essays are pretty in-depth, and they get at some really profound things about life and art.
Those essays were delivered as lectures at Harvard.
Oh, that's right. Right. They're adapted from
they're
lectures.
A little bit stream of consciousness,
Yeah.
but she kind of would pick a topic and then pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, they're brilliantly written, even though they were spoken, I guess, when they were originally delivered. But this is a little bit more – I'm trying to think of the word. This is like a little more of a snack. These are just very short pieces about different subjects on everything from, milkshakes to...
They're riffs.
They're little
Yeah.
riffs.
Yeah.
With a couple of slightly longer pieces thrown in. There's a very interesting piece about menopause and the way it feels to be a woman going through that. There's one about growing up poor and her family's Christmas lights and poverty and the way that played out in her neighborhood. But mostly it's just sort of, I don't want to say trifle because she's better than that, but it's something you can kind of dip into and out of.
She inhabits the page in an interesting way. I think she's deeply serious and literary, but she's also kind of perverse.
Yes,
she doesn't
she's
want
playful.
to be too self-serious. And I remember,
Definitely.
I think if that essay on menopause is the same one that was going around, I think last year.
We're going to talk about menopause the entire time now.
As a 40-year-old white man right now.
I'm comfortable with that.
I think Springsteen's gone through
No,
it.
but she has this beautiful essay on invisibility and aging. And it was one of those things that I remember women were passing around, just being like, we haven't seen anything like this, or we don't see it nearly enough.
That is the one where
and
she
it's sort
says
of complicated and ambivalent, and it sort of does, if it's the same one, also embrace certain powers of invisibility, but then...
Well, it starts with her. It starts with her sharing this page from a diary she kept of days she cried.
This is one,
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Which is both kind of very sad, but also funny the way
There
it looks.
is sadness throughout this book as kind of a running theme. Not depression necessarily, but just kind of living with sadness.
Yeah, it's light, but there's a
I
profound
think depression
kind of
is fair.
undercurrent.
I think it's a funny kind of easy, everyday, ubiquitous depression.
Yeah.
a light depression.
Do I reveal too much?
Carl, you don't have anything in front of you.
No, I'm reading frantically for work and to review, but the book that I'm reading in the evenings is The Wind in the Willows with my daughter. Have you guys?
Yes.
Of course.
A million years ago.
So I'm reading with my daughter, and I remember it being this like very cute story about mole and rat. And it's so much more. It's this incredibly...
It's a weird book.
It's so weird. And Toad is based on Oscar Wilde, which is amazing.
Really?
It's beautiful. It is what I remember. It is cozy and warm, and it is full of hanging around and messing about on boats. But it's also this like great tension between the hearth and the open wood. And it's this great thing, I think, to read with kids, especially my daughter's about to start walking. And it's this great sort of thing to read with her and to think about holding someone and letting them go, And it's, I just highly recommend it.
I remember that book having just kind of an Odd Couple vibe. The anal retentive compared to the chaos Muppet.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, they are a partnership in the
Yeah.
same way Frog and Toad. Yeah, it's a beautiful marriage. And it's so funny and it's wacky and it's a really good book to read out loud. And apparently now I'm becoming very curious about the author who apparently had a terrible relationship with his own son and wrote this book to his son when his son was about 5 years old, but then they were estranged. So I'm curious to see how it all fell apart now. So, Pamela, what are you reading?
I've been jumping around a little bit. I read almost all of a book called The Teenage Brain by Frances Jensen and Amy Ellis Nutt.
Which is terrifying.
Yes, it came out a couple of years ago, and I read it, for reasons having nothing to do with having a 12-year-old daughter, but purely intellectual. So I put that aside. And then I started reading N.W. by Zadie Smith, which I have wanted to read for a long time. And I was enjoying it, but I found that I'm finding recently that I can't read about terrible things that are relevant to the terrible things that are going on today. So I felt like the issues that she was getting at in that book, from drug addiction to class issues and income inequality, I just felt like it was too close. So I choose instead to read about unhappiness in turn of the last century Korea, and have picked up Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee.
Because Korea is not relevant at all.
Well, yes, it then became relevant. Yes.
Maybe read something else quick.
I know. At this point, I'm very early on in the book, and it drew me in immediately. And I have to say, I picked it up. I've been wanting to read it since I went to a luncheon for the author, and she told this story about the ethnic Koreans in Japan and how discriminated against and marginalized they are there, and about a teenage suicide of a ethnic Korean boy in Japan, and sort of how that raised this subject for her. And so I'd been wanting to read it for a long time, but then I kept thinking, I don't know, it's very long. And do I want to read this big novel about Korea?
It's a multi-generational family saga.
It's a multi-generational family saga. And it's definitely got that, huge sweep of history thing going on. But I was hooked immediately. So
this book is a great word of mouth reputation. And I don't know, because I was like, why do I keep hearing about Pachinko? But it's really people recommending it to each other. So
I don't know. Do people know the name Pachinko? It's this kind of gambling game that the Japanese.
It's like a pinball machine kind of thing, right?
Yes,
exactly.
And apparently the Koreans are the ones
Koreans
who
ran those Pachinko parlors in Japan, and so this family,
the depth of your knowledge about this is kind of deeply delightful. Shocking to me.
I read this book.
Okay.
Yes.
So the theme this week is gambling and menopause. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks. And rock and roll.
Yes.
But only my John Williams reading book.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.